Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're here because today we are diving into an absolutely wild 400-year-old story. We're looking at the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. Now, this is not just some dusty history lesson. We're looking at the literal blueprint of the modern global economy. We're talking staggering, jaw-dropping wealth, completely groundbreaking financial innovations, and, as you'll see, some of the darkest, most brutal realities of colonial expansion. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. When you picture the most powerful corporations today, you're probably thinking of those massive Silicon Valley tech giants, right? You know, the trillion-dollar companies that practically run our modern lives? But I want you to completely challenge that image for a second. Imagine a single company that didn't just have global offices, but its own private army. A company with the power to strike its own coins and the actual legal right to wage war. Basically, a company that acted as its own sovereign state. Crazy, right?
To really give you a sense of the jaw-dropping scale we're dealing with here, look at these numbers. Between 1602 and 1796, the VOC sent out 4,785 ships to Asia. Their closest rival, the super-famous British East India Company, only managed 2,690 ships in comparison. The VOC transported over 2.5 million tons of goods, which literally eclipsed all of its European competitors combined. Statistically speaking, there was the VOC and then there was everybody else. So how did this absolute behemoth actually come to be? Well, that brings us to Section 1, the first mega corporation. Back in the late 1500s, the Dutch were trying to solve a massive logistical nightmare. At the time, spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were the ultimate luxury goods in Europe. People used them for medicine, like treating gout, for preserving food, and obviously flavoring meat. But the supply chain, total disaster. Traditional overland routes through the eastern Mediterranean were heavily bottlenecked. Now, the Portuguese had found a sea route around Africa, but they fiercely guarded their monopoly. For independent Dutch merchants, trying to fund competing sea voyages was incredibly dangerous. You had shipwrecks, piracy, and it made the spice market wildly volatile. A sudden glut in supply could completely wipe out a merchant's profits overnight. Well, the Dutch government looked at this and realized all this intense internal competition was just ruining them. So they innovated. In 1602, they forced all these smaller competing merchant fleets, these pre-companies, to consolidate into one giant state-sponsored cartel, the United East India Company. They handed this single entity a 21-year monopoly on all Asian trade. But here's the real kicker. They gave the VOC quasi-sovereign powers. This wasn't just a business. It was a heavily armed geopolitical weapon empowered to build forts, negotiate treaties, and literally wage war on behalf of the Dutch Republic.
And this brilliantly illustrates how they pulled it off financially. To fund such massive ambition, the VOC was structured across 6 regional chambers in Dutch port cities, raising a total of over 6.4 million guilders. That is the equivalent of hundreds of millions of euros today. You can clearly see Amsterdam took the lead here, but this was a truly national financial amalgamation. Everyday citizens, we're talking bakers, merchants, even immigrants, they all pooled their money to launch this unprecedented mega corporation.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, inventing modern corporate finance. What the VOC did next didn't just change global trade, it fundamentally invented modern corporate finance. They pioneered concepts that we just take completely for granted today. For starters, they were the world's very first joint stock limited liability company. Unlike previous ventures that basically liquidated after just one voyage, the VOC's capital was permanent. If you wanted your money back, you couldn't just withdraw it from the company. You had to go and sell your shares to someone else on an open-air secondary market. And that literally birthed the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Plus, it was an incredibly lucrative bet. They paid out annual dividends averaging 18% for almost 2 whole centuries. But of course, with modern finance comes modern corporate drama. Meet Isaac Lemire. He was actually one of the VOC's largest early investors, but in 1609, he formally petitioned against the VOC, the board of directors. He complained they were holding on to investors' money for way too long and using it for things the shareholders didn't actually approve of. Because of this, he is recorded as history's first ever short seller and shareholder activist. It just goes to show you that management disputes and shareholder activism are practically as old as the corporation itself. All right, let's move on to Section 3. Quest for the spice monopoly. Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive economic puzzle they had to solve. Buying spices halfway across the world was tricky because Europe just didn't produce many goods that Asian markets actually wanted to buy. That meant Europeans were stuck paying in silver and gold, slowly draining their own wealth. The genius solution came from a VOC governor general named Jan Pieterszoon. He figured out this brilliant intra-Asiatic trade loop. Instead of shipping precious metals all the way from Europe, the VOC started using silver and copper acquired in Japan to buy silk and textiles in China and India. Then they'd trade those textiles for spices in Indonesia and simply ship the spices back to Europe. By acting as the middleman within Asia, they funded their own operations and kept European silver right where it was. However, this massive global monopoly wasn't built on clever accounting alone. It was enforced with absolute, unyielding military might. In 1614, that same executive, Jean Pieterszoon, wrote a letter to the board of directors back in the Republic. He stated it very plainly: "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." And that chilling quote really marks the pivot point into the darker, deeply violent realities of the VOC's business model. Which leads us directly into Section 4, the brutal cost of business. The VOC was obviously a commercial enterprise, but its unique charter to act as a quasi-sovereign state meant it frequently used devastating violence, exploitation, and colonialism to protect its bottom line. For example, to secure an absolute global monopoly on nutmeg, the VOC targeted the Banda Islands. When the local population naturally resisted this Dutch monopoly, the VOC launched brutal punitive expeditions. The demographic impact here was just devastating. Prior to the Dutch conquest, the population of those islands was estimated at around 15,000 people. Through systematic violence, starvation, and enslavement, that population dropped to roughly 1,000 survivors, who were then forced to labor on Dutch plantations. Now, the extreme danger of this era heavily impacted the company's own workforce as well. The VOC's operations were incredibly hazardous. Historical estimates actually suggest the company consumed approximately 4,000 of its own employees every single year. These staggering losses were driven by shipwrecks, terrible diseases like scurvy and dysentery, and constant clashes with rival trading companies or local populations. Out of 1 million people who left Holland for the East Indies, only about a third of them ever made it back. Furthermore, the VOC systematically relied on the global slave trade to sustain its sprawling colonial outposts. For instance, when they established the Cape Colony in modern-day South Africa as a resupply station, the VOC imported enslaved people from West Africa, Madagascar, India, and the Indonesian archipelago. They also engaged in prolonged violent conflicts with the indigenous Khoikhoi pastoralists, displacing them from their ancestral lands and dismantling their society, just to expand Dutch farming territories. And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, the collapse of the VOC. So how exactly does an untouchable behemoth with this much wealth, power, and ruthlessness finally crumble? Well, by the mid to late 18th century, the company entered an era of what historians call profitless growth. The decline wasn't just caused by one single thing. It was a perfect storm of internal rot and external pressures. They started losing their grip on the intra-Asiatic trade as the global political landscape shifted. Their rigid centralization over in Batavia meant they simply couldn't compete with rivals who were shipping tea directly from China to Europe. Add in those massive mortality rates we talked about, paying out heavy dividends they couldn't actually afford by draining their capital reserves, and internal corruption so rampant that by the 1790s, the Dutch joked the initials VOC stood for Vergaan under corruption, perished under corruption. Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds, watching the dominoes fall into absolute bankruptcy. In 1740, economic downturns and terrible governance led to a massacre of thousands of ethnic Chinese residents in Batavia by VOC troops. By 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out, and the British decimated half of the VOC's fleet, inflicting financial damages the company just couldn't absorb. Net assets literally dropped to zero. Fast forward to 1796, the board of directors was sacked. And finally, on December 31st, 1799, the VOC's charter expired for good, and the bankrupt ruins of the once mighty company were officially nationalized by the Dutch government. Which really leaves us with this final question to chew on. In the modern era, politicians and business leaders have sometimes praised the VOC mentality. They're usually referring to a spirit of bold innovation, risk-taking, and dynamic entrepreneurship that essentially built the modern financial world. But as we've clearly seen from the source material, that exact same machinery was inextricably linked to horrific colonial violence, monopoly by warfare, and systemic exploitation. So what is the true legacy of the VOC? Can you really separate the financial genius from the immense human cost? That is definitely something to think about long after this explainer ends. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.